Story 1. Until I met my first boyfriend's parents, who are now my in-laws, I experienced their caring, supportive, and funny nature. Even as teenagers, they treated us like adults while also knowing when to give us space. Story 2. Most of my life, I grew up and realized they are broken and hurt people experiencing this world for the first time just like I am. Then I understood they did their best, and I love them even more for it. Story 3. I was at a friend's house, and they were in the kitchen getting a snack for us when they dropped the plate, which shattered. I completely froze, expecting some sort of explosion. Instead, his mom came in to check if he was all right and if he needed help cleaning up the mess. There was no blame, no incrimination, no punishment, and no yelling. I was beyond confused. Later on, I asked him why she didn't yell at or punish him, and he seemed genuinely confused. Why would she? It was just an accident. Story 4. When I realized that my perspective on myself and the world was not typical, I noticed that my parents have a superficial interest in me, or at least that is all they show. I went through a difficult divorce in which my ex-wife made false accusations, and I was unable to see my children for months. My parents live across the country, and when I was having a tough night about a week after not seeing my kids, I texted my mom to express how hard it was. I received a text from my dad 10 minutes later that said, "It's only been a week." Story 5. Maybe when my dad left us 50 years ago and never supported us. He did try to make contact about 20 years ago, but I told him to go away. Story 6. I think I was about 6 or 7 when my mom pulled my sister by the hair and threw her out the front door in her nightdress during winter. I was getting ready in the bathroom for school. My dad left not long after, around 10 or 11, but he didn't really spend much time with me, so I didn't realize he was unpleasant. Then, when he screamed at me in front of my friends for not putting the washing away, I did it while he yelled. He called me a failure, useless, and said I took no responsibility. So, pretty early on, there were signs that my parents were terrible. There may have been moments that happened earlier, but I thought I was bad, and internalized it as my fault. Joke's on them. I then became the teenager they deserved. Story 7. When they ran away, they left a 7-year-old girl alone with a man she trusted blindly. Story 8. When my stepmom grabbed my diary and started reading it out loud at the dinner table, she became offended that she wasn't portrayed as some kind of saint. My dad didn't stop her. Story 9. I don't think I ever believed they were good. To be fair, my mom got pregnant at 15 and didn't have parents herself while growing up. By the time I was a young adult, they both had another child with their second partners, and they were good at parenting my younger brothers, though. Story 10. When my mother and half-sister used to mimic me when I cried, they would laugh in my face. I was about 5 or 6 years old. Story 11. When I realized I was more afraid of my parents' reactions than of any actual consequences of my actions, I understood that fear should not be the foundation of a family. Story 12. I have amazing, loving, and caring parents. They are great people. However, a major flaw they have is that they get offended when I don't parent my children the exact same way they did. They were both raised in less than ideal family conditions and improved my life compared to theirs. I'm just doing the same thing. Story 13. I have always chosen not to judge my parents because no one is perfect. As a parent myself, I have made my share of mistakes. However, I truly realized how detrimental my mother was when she attempted to spread falsehoods about me to family and friends in a bid to take my child. She had no legal grounds for her actions, but she tried to isolate me and undermine my support system. Ultimately, she has failed miserably and is now permanently out of my life. Story 14. Not the first, but the first to make an impact. Sitting down to watch my son's first t-ball practice, I realized that I had taken him to more practices and attended more games than my parents combined. Story 15. When my therapist pointed out that I was raising myself and others when I was a child and teenager, rather than the other way around, I realized that although they handled all the physical work and paid for things, I was the one doing all the emotional labor and focusing on my future. Story 16. My dad abandoned my sister and me with our career-obsessed, highly strung, and neglectful mother when I was 12. I was largely raised by au pairs and nannies, I honestly didn't realize either of them were bad parents until I was about 20. Doesn't everyone's parents just collectively disappear? Story 17. I think I have always known. I never fully allowed myself to rely on them because of it. I never realized how lonely it was until I got older. It is a really cruel way to grow up. Story 18. When I was 10, I went to a friend's house for a playdate. When I arrived, she and her dad were playing catch in the backyard. I was amazed at how her dad was spending time with her. My dad barely looked at me when he was home, which wasn't often. I suddenly realized that good dads do more than provide a paycheck. Story 19. I had an idea about it when their favorite child, my older brother, was favored and catered to, and it was blatantly obvious. I am one of four, and we all knew it. I also had a pretty good idea when my dad, an officer for an insurance company, told me that my choices were to go to college or to work in fast food, saying, "What do you like? Fries with that?" He knew I was always a terrible student, yet he burdened me with tons of student loans anyway because I thought I didn't have a choice. Now I look back and know for a fact that my parents were narcissistic, and I'm not using the term casually. I can see from my mother's actions that she truly was a narcissist. As kids, my younger brother and I would watch my father tell my mother she could pick out any quartz or granite countertop that she desired. She would love the granite countertop for about a month before announcing to everyone that my father made her get it and that she didn't have a choice. My brother and I would look at each other completely baffled. She did this with so many things: furniture, houses, light fixtures, new hardwood flooring, you name it. One of her other big issues was constantly criticizing us for doing things wrong. One day she would tell us that we had to fill the dishwasher in a specific way. We would ask her to show us how she wanted it filled. But the next day she'd be screaming about how we didn't fill it the right way, and today she'd have found a completely different method. Again, this was the type of behavior she exhibited all the time. Story 20. I told my mom I was thinking about ending my life, and she became annoyed. This response made me lose interest in suicide. I wondered what the point was if no one cares. Story 21. When I first went into therapy in college, it was to understand why I was so unhappy and whether my feelings stemmed from seeing myself as a failure. The therapist asked where I got such ideas, and the conversation developed from there. Story 22. When I was sexually abused, they did not take any action. I do not hate them. Perhaps they did not know how to respond. Story 23. When I was young, my mother called for me to help her because she feared my father would hurt her. It was no place for a child. Story 24. When I saw how different the parents of my romantic partners were compared to mine, I realized that my parents were completely self-absorbed and lacked the common sense necessary to make sound life decisions. They were not good at being parents, which was a really hard realization, and I have never fully gotten over it. The real kicker? My dad used to criticize me for being lazy. I later found out that he never worked more than 30 hours a week for his entire adult life, which is why we were always so broke when I was a kid. Story 25. I never really thought about it because I realized my parents were human and imperfect and did their best. Not perfect, not horrible, just regular people trying to keep it all together, sometimes succeeding and sometimes faltering. I'm good with it. Story 26. I never engaged in sports because my dad tried to live vicariously through me. He signed me up for baseball and I couldn't play anything else. Story 27. When I was 7, my mother and grandfather publicly humiliated me over a trivial situation. They found out about it and I was honest, but they proceeded to tell every family member as if I had committed a crime. It didn't stop there. They continued this behavior until they passed away, sharing things I had done that I either hadn't done or that didn't need to be shared. Throughout my life, my mother would pretend I was the problem and would lie or humiliate me to shift the blame away from her poor parenting. There's more, but that stands out to me. Story 28. When I was 7, my dad told me I was allowed to get into as many fights as I liked as long as I won. If I lost, I would receive a beating at home as well. However, he didn't follow through. One day, when I acted like a jerk and came home with a knot on my head, he just laughed at me. Story 29. Not really sure, but one day something happened, and I realized she was the role model for how not to be. Story 30. I don't understand whether you mean bad in an everyday sense, abusive, or somewhat pathological. It was revealing to me that my parents often acted out of their anxiety instead of considering my best interests. They aimed to protect me or themselves from what might happen rather than weighing the pros and cons of allowing me to make my own mistakes and face the consequences, or potentially losing face as a good family. However, they weren't particularly bad, certainly not traumatizing. They were just sometimes guided by emotions that didn't align with effective parenting. Is that what you're asking? Because that's very different from other possibilities. Story 31. My parents were never bad at parenting. However, being their age now has made understanding some of their decisions back then a bit easier. Story 32. When I went to my friend's house, I saw how their parents were. I always wanted to live with my friend's family. Story 33. When I got a long-term partner, they noticed how my mother frequently argued with me over things I had done. My partner thought my mother was being unreasonable, while I had just assumed it was something I did. My partner saw the messages and reacted in a way that confused me. Story 34. Way too late. I thought I was the problem. Not so fun fact. The child is never the problem, except in very extreme cases. Maybe. Story 35. When you grow up unable to have a healthy relationship with people, you may seek happiness in others or search for that missing piece of the puzzle. Story 36. I always suspected that they were not good. However, as I aged, got married, and started a family of my own, it became unavoidable. With my adult children grown and gone, it is clear that my parents were a disaster. I have spent much of my adult life examining the issues I absorbed from my childhood. Story 37. When I was old enough to start having sleepovers, I noticed that my friends' parents were home, made dinner, and didn't leave them alone overnight. Story 38. In hindsight, that time when my stepfather shot himself in the hand while I was in the room, I wandered into the living room to find my mom asleep. He then came in, bleeding everywhere, and she was rather brutally sobered up by her now injured husband. Story 39. When I was 13, I was put on a plane to Mexico. To be fair, at that time you could walk up to the gate without a ticket. However, the layover in Dallas without a chaperone was risky. In the end, I turned out fine. My parents were okay. It was just a poor lapse in judgment. Story 40. When my dad retired and moved to Florida, it became clearer that there was less and less to share during our phone calls. I really wish I could have had an empathetic, supportive, and less judgmental dad like most kids. Story 41. When I asked my friends if their parents also mistreated them, I inquired about their parents' drinking habits and drug use. It became clear to me early on that my parents were not good people, but I felt powerless to change the situation. Story 42. My dad passed away when I was only 7 years old. My mom coped with alcohol. I realized things were not okay when she reacted to my request for dinner with a backhand, slamming me against the wall and then just staring at me before walking away. Story 43. There were two things. 1. I was frequently asked for money the moment I received it, and gifts on my birthdays usually ended up being loaned to my parents. They would then charge living expenses until they no longer had to pay me back. This might not sound bad until you realize I was around 10 years old. Being a staunch Republican and conspiracy theorist at around 12 was not the best indicator of how I was raised. I genuinely felt like the world was 6 months away from total collapse until I was about 18. Story 44. They didn't say they would talk to my sisters whenever they cursed me out as they had promised. Story 45. As a young child, my parents were married but raised me in completely different ways. My mother was physically abusive, short-tempered, and seemed perpetually annoyed with me. My dad was phenomenal and patient in a way I still can't comprehend as an adult. When I was young, I wanted to spend every possible moment with my dad because he was my favorite person. I did everything I could to avoid being around my mother. I was terrified of her and realized something wasn't right, even at that age. Story 46. When I realized that my father threw more tantrums than my brother or me, I found it difficult. My mother would complain to me about my father, but I did not feel free to share the problems I had in my life. Story 47. When you try to understand them, It is difficult to forgive due to the traumas, their irresponsibility, and lack of support and guidance. Story 48. When they had physical fights with each other, my sister had to call the police. This was a warning sign. Story 49. I figured it out when I was about 5 years old and I watched my dad push my sister's head through drywall, which was tough when I was 11. Story 50. When I grew up, my wife asked me why it took me so long to have a child with someone. Most people my age already have mature children. My reply was short and clear. I did everything in my power to be better than my father. Took time and I succeeded. My child has a father. Story 51. God. I don't even remember. I realized my dad was neglectful at a very young age, around 7 or 8. While my mom was out running errands, my dad would sleep or focus only on himself. I was responsible for the 3-year-old and the baby, changing diapers and keeping them entertained. He did nothing to help. I was probably 12 or 13 when I realized my mom wasn't great either. She didn't defend me against my dad's unreasonable punishments. She didn't try to protect me from him. I started working at 14 to pay the mortgage and grocery bills, as well as to have money for things I wanted. He would even ransack my room and steal my money. I bought myself a PlayStation 2, and he took it to use as a DVD player. If I bought food and had leftovers, he just ate it. Nothing felt like it was actually mine. All our conversations were just yelling at each other. Story 52. They called me too sensitive for worrying about things that seemed minor to them, yet my mother would do the same, which made me develop a fear of sharing my feelings with my parents or anyone else. I can't even cry or express that I'm upset in front of them. My mother physically and emotionally neglected me, then expected me to be a caregiver for her. I still care for her, but thankfully our relationship is more balanced now. We both contribute to cleaning and managing household chores, and I actually have a life. My other parent never discussed feelings either, so I grew up unable to talk about certain emotions. Now, I feel somewhat emotionally numb and likely dissociated from my feelings, which makes me too scared to talk about anything. Story 53. In therapy as an adult, I have realized that much of the issues with my psyche stem from childhood and adolescent trauma. Some of this trauma originated from my parents, while most came from other sources. Honestly, it is still difficult to accept that their actions and the lessons I learned were harmful, and I continue to struggle to overcome these challenges. Story 54. Not my parents, but my grandparents. My grandmother drove across the country with my mother in a drawer from a dresser. Story 55. When they prioritized themselves and their happiness over me and my brother every single time, I began to understand what being mean, unkind, and selfish meant. This realization started around the age of 10 to 12. Don't get me wrong. The essentials were provided. We had food, hand-me-down clothes, and structure, but there was no love and no time. We were a wild group that roamed the woods until dark, and we were kicked out of the house after senior year with no understanding of money, no bank account, and no resources. Our parents just told us to get a haircut and find a job. I promised myself that I would not treat my child the same way, and I have not. Story 56. At 2.5 years old, my sister was born and she was always in a playpen. Mom made us go to her country club and put her in a playpen while she played tennis and swam. She shouldn't have kids. Story 57. When I met my best friend in high school, I noticed how her parents interacted with her and her siblings. Now that I am an adult, I continue to recognize how much of my innocence was taken away because of my parents. Honestly, I do not care to have much of a relationship with them. Story 58. I believe you truly understand this when you become a parent. The most important thing is to be a good person, and your children will emulate that. You cannot choose your parents, but you can choose the kind of person you want to be. Story 59. When a friend invited me over for a birthday party, I saw how healthy their relationship was as a family. That's when I knew mine was dysfunctional, and I wished I had been born into a different family. Story 60. When I was about 12, my dad refused to believe that I hadn't taken a $20 bill from the top of the fridge. He eventually found it, but there was no hint of apology or accountability from him. Story 61. When they had children, they did so despite being related to each other. A few of their kids ended up in foster care because they saw no issue with inflicting heavy beatings and strangling their own children, among many other things. Story 62. Mom was a bipolar alcoholic battling herself every day to maintain normalcy. She only got sober once all the kids finished high school, with me being the last. I am proud of her for conquering her alcohol addiction, but a part of me is still bitter that she only became a real mom once all her kids graduated. I don't recognize or relate to this new version of her, to be honest. I love her despite my rocky relationship with her. Dad never really learned how to express his emotions in a healthy way because he grew up in a time when racism was the norm. It was not acceptable for men to complain about anything, and he was a Vietnam War veteran who was clearly affected by it, even though he never showed any symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in front of the family. Story 63. I constantly struggle with feelings of inadequacy, believing that I am not intelligent, and I feel something is wrong with me for having both attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism. Story 64. My parents did not want to teach me things. I had to figure everything out by myself while I was in high school. It was my brother, who is 2 years older, that taught me to drive. Additionally, my parents often spoke to me in a condescending manner, making me feel like I lacked intelligence. My confidence suffered significantly in their presence. They would never admit they were wrong. Story 65. When I was parenting my teenage daughters, I realized how harsh and reactive my mother had been with me. She caused me a lot of anxiety, and I was a good kid. Story 66. Being around functional parents instead of dysfunctional ones. I remember one night when my car wouldn't start, and my best friend's dad decided to give me a ride back home from the market where my car was stranded. All he said was, "Get some rest. We'll see what's wrong with your car tomorrow. I'll jumpstart it, and if the battery is fine, then it might be the alternator." He tried jumpstarting my car, but it still wouldn't turn on. Then he said, "Well, we might as well remove the alternator and test it. If that's not the problem, then you'll have to call the tow truck." He helped take the entire alternator out, and later I found out that it was worn out. Then he helped me put the new one back in. I just remember thinking to myself, my parents would have just told me to figure it out myself, yell at me and tell me to call the tow truck. I received more kindness and help from those 2 days with one single adult than I ever did from my own parents and family. Story 67. When my daughter was born, I would often look at her and wonder how I could ever do to her the things my father had previously done to me. While my mother didn't engage in any explicit violence, I sometimes feel anger towards her for being complicit and staying with my father. Story 68. When I became a parent, I wanted more and better emotional support for my children and realized what I had missed as a child. Story 69. When I moved out, I realized how much healing I needed to live a normal life. You don't notice the cage when you grow up inside it. Story 70. When I was about 5, my mother got out of bed one morning, and my dad pulled back the covers and said, "Come hop in bed with me." This continued for years because I was too scared to tell anyone. Story 71. I realized it about my dad when I was 8 years old. I blamed the shortcomings on my single mother, who had to fill both roles when he left for the second time when I was 11. I didn't understand how wrong I was until my mid to late 20s. Story 72. When I had my son, I understood that parenting is challenging. However, the solution is certainly not to raise your child in a harmful environment or allow your partner to abuse them in any way. Story 73. The moment my child was born, I loved him unconditionally. It was indescribable. I realized that this is what was missing. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.